Hello, I'm going to be talking about Good Country People today by Flannery O'Connor. Good Country People begins by explaining a normal morning in Mrs. Hopewell's house. Mrs. Hopewell starts her day at 7 a.m., and when Mrs. Freeman arrives, they spend the morning chatting, gossiping, and the conversation normally ends up centered around Mrs. Freeman's daughters. By this point, Joy, also known as Holga, Mrs. Hopewell's 32-year-old daughter, is awake and has made her way to the kitchen. The Freemans are tenant farmers that Mrs. Hopewell hired. Mrs. Hopewell describes Mrs. Freeman's daughters as some of the finest girls she has ever seen, and they are often the center of morning conversation, as I said before. Mrs. Freeman is notorious for being in everybody's business, but Mrs. Hopewell decided to use this to her advantage when she hired her 4 years ago. Mrs. Hopewell says the reason the Freemans have stayed for so long is because they are good country people. Mrs. Hopewell's daughter, Joy, has a distasteful attitude and makes her discontentment very much known. Mrs. Hopewell is often the one who gets the brunt of it, but she lets it go because of Joy's wooden leg and what she's been through. Her leg was shot off in a hunting accident when she was 10 years old. Joy is extremely educated and has a doctorate in philosophy, but has to live at home due to her health condition. Joy legally changed her name to Holga, but her mother refuses to call her that and instead calls her Joy. The conflict begins with a man named Manly Pointer. He is a Bible salesman and he appears on the front doorstep of Mrs. Hopewell's home. He manipulates her into inviting him to stay for dinner by portraying himself as one of those good country people that she very much likes. During that whole dinner, Holga ignored Manly Pointer, and no matter how hard he tried to get her attention, she just remained unbothered. He told his whole life story at this dinner and stayed way past his welcome, but he did manage to secure a date with Holga the next day at 10 a.m., regardless of the way she treated him at dinner. Holga only agreed to this date with the goal of seducing Manly Pointer, a devout Christian. The date begins with a walk. They end up kissing and talking about salvation, damnation, and everything in between. Holga takes Manly Pointer to a barn loft where they kiss some more. Manly Pointer slips Holga's glasses in his pocket at one point because they get in the way, and he tells Holga he loves her. She does not say it back like he wants her to. Manly Pointer eventually asks Holga to show him where her real leg joins the wooden one. She is hesitant at first, but she agrees. Once it is off and is in Manly Pointer's grasp, she tells him to put it back on, but he says no and places it out of her reach. At this point, Holga is panicking and he begins to kiss her again. Manly Pointer then opens his valise and takes a Bible out. He opens it and it is revealed to be hollow. It contains a flask of whiskey, a pack of cards, and a small blue box. Holga is completely turned off by this turn of events and demands he give her leg back. Instead of giving it back, he packs his stuff up, places it back in his valise, along with her wooden leg. He leaves the loft and leaves Holga stranded. But on his way down, he manages to tell her that she isn't as smart as she thinks she is. While Mrs. Hopewell and Mrs. Freeman are digging up onions, they see Manly Pointer heading to the highway from the barn, which he just left. Mrs. Hopewell thinks he was selling Bibles to her neighbors and describes him as simple. Mrs. Freeman, on the other hand, doesn't really give her opinion, but she makes it clear that she doesn't think people could be that simple. So, with that whole summary out of the way, the story reveals a lot about the hierarchy of social classes in the rural South. Mrs. Hopewell makes these classes very clear. We have trash, good country people like Mrs. Freeman, and then people like Mrs. Hopewell who are at the top. According to The Mechanical World of Good Country People by Constance Pierce, Mrs. Hopewell's tolerance for people in some ways seems directly proportionate to their usefulness. Thus, she has divided the world into good country people, who, though they are sometimes irritating, deserve her patience, and trash who do not. Both Mrs. Hopewell and Holga have this narrow view of society, and it ends up putting them in some undesirable situations, specifically Holga. When Manly Pointer is first introduced in the story, Mrs. Hopewell instantly categorizes him as good country people. He portrays himself as a devout Christian who is simply selling Bibles in an effort to one day become a missionary. Holga and Mrs. Hopewell don't question him, and they take everything he says as truth. This leads Holga to come up with a plan to seduce him to show that she is smarter and has more control. Once this plan is in action, though, it is clear that she is not in control. Manly Pointer reveals that he is in fact not a devout Christian and is an atheist just like Holga. He actually tells Holga, "You ain't so smart. I've been believing in nothing ever since I was born." Holga's reaction to this turn in events is shock, and she turns back to those class lines, trying to understand how this could happen. She asks Manly Pointer, "Aren't you just good country people?" She viewed herself above Manly Pointer because of her place in society. She has a good education and is the daughter of a farm owner, which is the top. According to Religion as the Grotesque in Flannery O'Connor and Dorothy Allison by Margaret Cipriano, Holga, in her self-assumed intellectual superiority in its roots in her ignorance of human nature, leads her to think Manly Pointer inferior to her. She didn't think it possible that those below her could be capable of being anything other than simple, what she knew to be true. On the other side of things, like Manly Pointer, Mrs. Freeman challenges this perception throughout the whole story. After the revelation concerning Manly Pointer and his motives, it is clear that there is no such thing as good country people in the way Mrs. Hopewell and Holga think. People just aren't that simple. This doesn't necessarily mean that Mrs. Freeman has some underlying motive that Manly Pointer did, but it does suggest that she has a more accurate view of the world around her in society. She knows people are never as simple as they seem and makes her view clear by the end of the story. In response to seeing Manly Pointer run across the highway, she even says, "Some can't be that simple. I know I never could." Mrs. Freeman is able to perceive the world for what it really is and know that class doesn't necessarily define who a person is. Overall, Manly Pointer and Mrs. Freeman both reveal a hard truth about the rural South. Class lines are not so simple, and not everyone can be simple, good country people. Mrs. Hopewell and Holga, the two characters that portray the upper class, both believe those around them to be inferior, therefore they don't think them capable of outsmarting them. Mrs. Hopewell ignores the truth if it benefits her in any way, while Holga uses it to shove her believed superiority on others. This flawed perception ultimately puts them at risk and makes them easy to manipulate. On the other hand, Manly Pointer and Mrs. Freeman know that these perceived class lines are not accurate, and they use the ignorance of Mrs. Hopewell and Holga to their advantage.